So, Norfolk has a long coastline, and I'm betting that some of you, maybe many of you, maybe all of you have walked it at least once. I don't mean the whole coast, that would be a long walk. I'm talking about some of the coast. We all like to visit the seaside and see what's there, and normally it's people. But you know, if you take yourself away from the madding crowd, you know, there are lots of little creatures. And this is a story about two of those creatures. For you see, at one end of the beach lived crab, and several miles the other end of the beach lived lobster. And they were the best of friends. But they had busy lives and they didn't get to see each other very often. Well, it was a fine, fair day, and Crab thought, I think I'm going to go and see my old mate Lobster. I haven't seen him for so long. I'm going to go and see him. So off he went, and as you know, crabs, well, they walk sideways, and he was walking sideways along the beach, and he had a wonderful view out at sea. And as he was walking along, he could see, the clouds were building. Oh, he could see there was a storm coming in, but he thought, I'm still going to go and see Lobster. Well, he carried on walking along the beach, and the storm just the clouds were building and building, and he could see there was going to be a storm. Well, then he could see Lobster in the distance, and he thought, he's getting his boat out, and there's a storm coming in. Well, anyway, eventually, Crab got to where Lobster, he said, Crab, my old mate. Well, they gave each other the biggest hug that you ever did see. Careful with their clippers that they didn't clip each other on their bottom or anywhere like that, anywhere delicate. You know, they very, very, very carefully hugged each other. So good to see you. Lobster said, he said, come sailing with me. No, said Crab. It's a storm coming in. It's the best time to go sailing, said Lobster. It's the best time when there's a bit of a storm. No, I don't want to do that, said Crab. Well, Lobster said, you've come all this way to see me. Come sailing with me. Will it be all right, said Crab. I'm your friend, he said, trust me, it'll be really good. He said, come with me. Well, reluctantly, Crab agreed. He got into the boat, and Lobster pushed it off, hopped into the boat, the wind took the sail, and off they went out across the sea. Well, the storm just got a little bit closer, and the sea began to kind of just, a little bit of this movement. And there was a little bit of wind kind of building, and then the storm got a bit closer, and the sea began to really begin to kind of move like this. The boat was up and down. Poor old Crab, he was like, seasick over the side. Well, the storm came in a bit closer, and soon it was up and down and up, and Crab was on the bottom going, I don't like this. Meanwhile, Lobster was like, whoa, this is wonderful. He was going in there, breathing in the air. Well, suddenly a huge wave hit the boat, flipped the boat up, and catapulted Crab straight out of the boat, flying through the air. Ah! He hit the water. Lobster got thrown out of the boat. Woohoo! Went Lobster, yoo-hoo! And he imagined that he had long, golden, curly hair just kind of flowing in the wind as he sailed through the air going, yoo-hoo! Now, I know you're saying that lobsters haven't got long, curly hair, but this lobster imagined that he had long, flowing, curly hair. And he hit the water, and Crab said to him, I can't swim. And Lobster said, you're a crab. You can breathe underwater. Oh yeah, I forgot that, said Crab. I forgot all about that. Well, they just went down and down, blah, 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 to the sea floor. And then they began to walk along the sea floor, back to the beach. Well, they saw Starfish. Hi, Starfish, they said. Gave him a high five, Hi. They saw Sharky the shark, their mate. Hello, Sharky, you all right? Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. They saw their best mate, the whale. Hi, how are you? Yeah. And they were all like kind of chatting away. And, well, they eventually got to the shore, and they climbed out of the water, and the storm had passed. It was a beautiful sunny day. And Lobster turned to Crab and said, haven't you had the best fun ever? And Crab looked at his friend and he said, do you know what? I think I have. Well, they hugged once again, careful not to clip each other with their clippers. They hugged each other, they bid each other farewell, and they went their separate ways. And that's the story of Lobster and Crab.
We're very fortunate in this part of the country because we have such a wonderful variety of landscapes. And the story I'm going to tell you today is from the Fens. Now the Fens start south of King's Lynn and west of Downham Market. Downham Market is the gateway to the Fens. But the Fens are very, very different now than they were hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, the Fens were peaty, boggy places which were rife with evil ones, so dead hands and witches and bogarts and many other things. But that's not what this story is about. The people of the Fens, they understood the landscape, and maybe when we see it today in our mind's eye, we think what an awful place it is to live in, and perhaps the Fens, because they are the flatlands. People call Norfolk the flatlands, but the Fens are the flatlands. And they've always been flat, but they were full of marshes, and the marsh men and women, they loved it there. It was their homes. That's where they worked. They would cut the reeds, they would cut peat, they would fish. But it's a place where, after dark, unless the moon was full, you really didn't want to go. But this was a time when people understood. They understood the land. They understood the cycles of the seasons. They understood the cycles of the moon. And they respected it. They respected all of these things, and they learnt to respect the land and the marshes. And their relationship with the marshes was one of awe and fear, because in the marshes there lived a being, a creature called Tiddimun. Now he was called Tiddimun maybe because he was a tiny man. He was no higher than a 3-year-old, and he had grey hair which was long, 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 and a grey beard that went all the way down to the ground. And he had a grey cloak which just trailed behind him. And when the mists came off the marshes, you could barely see him, because that's what would happen. As the sun went down and as the moon rose, Tiddimun could sometimes be seen just in the tendrils of mist as it came up onto the land. And the people of the land, they would go out every new moon, and they would send him a wishing. Tiddimun, who's got no name, Tiddimun, we come again. And if the waters were high, they would go out and they would say, Tiddimun, without a name, Tiddimun, the waters are high again. And in the morning they would know that the waters that had soaked the straw on their floors in their houses would be dry. Well, trouble came when Charles I decided that they would drain the marshes. Now the marshes go all the way from Norfolk, Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. It is a very large area. And they had done the same thing in Holland very successfully. They had drained the marshes, and now they had the best farming land there. So King Charles got all the best engineers over, and then they brought the Dutchmen over to clear the marshes. Well, the marsh folk were beside themselves. They were so angry. They knew that this was a really bad thing to do, that Tiddimun would not be happy. So they refused to speak to the Dutchmen. They refused to give them board or lodging. But this didn't stop the marshes from being drained. And the dikes grew longer and longer. And then a couple of the Dutchmen went missing. They could not find them anywhere. And the marsh people knew. They knew that Tiddimun was angry and that he had taken them. But they just brought over some more Dutchmen. And more went missing, but still they continued with the work. But then Tiddimun turned his anger on the people. He made their cows sicken, and their milk dry up. Their pigs died. Their chickens stopped laying. Their crops failed. And worst of all, their children, their babies, died from the marsh fever. The people were beside themselves. They didn't know what to do. And then some of the older ones there gathered the community together and said, "Do you not remember? Do you not remember what we used to do? We would go out every new moon and we would speak to Tiddimun. We would ask him to help us, or we would tell him that we respected him." And so when they came together like that, they decided on the next new moon, the dark of the moon, that they would each of them gather together a cup or a bucket or some receptacle which would hold water. And together they walked to the edge of a dike and they tipped their water into the dike. And they said the words, "Tiddimun, Tiddimun," without a name. "Tiddimun, please lift your curse." And they waited. They waited, huddled together in silence, to hear the sound of the Tiddimun, because the Tiddimun sounded like a peewit, a marsh bird. Pwit, pwit. But they did not hear that. After a while, into that heavy silence came the sound of babies, of children crying, of wailing. The women, they took their shawls around them, and the men, they huddled together. And they listened while these sounds of children crying got louder and louder, and the women swore that they felt the kiss on their lips of their children, of a small hand holding their hand. And they stood and they wept whilst listening to this. And the women wailed, "Tiddimun, Tiddimun, please break your curse." And then again there was silence. And then they heard it. They heard the sound of the peewit. Pwit, pwit. And the men, they put their hands in the air and they shouted and they ran. They ran all the way back to their homes. But the women, they could still feel the touch of those lips and the touch of the small hands. So they put their shawls around their shoulders and they walked back. Every new moon from that time on, they went down and they emptied water into the dike, and they said the words, "Tiddimun, without a name, we bring you water." And this went on for many years whilst the work on the dikes was still being done. And then one day, they realised that they had not heard the peewit anymore when they went down. Month after month they went, but there was never any sound of the Tiddimun. And so maybe he had gone. And from that day to this, there are many in the fens who have never heard of this story. They do not know that land anymore. No one knows where the Tiddimun went.
So one of the things that I noticed in the lockdown of 2020 was how many new hobbies a lot of people took up, particularly people who were furloughed. And people were making sourdough, people were learning macrame and crochet, lots of people discovering what was on their doorstep, places where they could go walking and where they could connect with nature, just walking 5 minutes out of their door. One of the things that I noticed among the people that I know was a big uptake in wild swimming. And this story that I'm going to share with you now is a story that's inspired by some of my friends who've been wild swimming in the local rivers and in the sea up on the North Norfolk coast throughout this time, and have continued to do so, and have amazingly continued to do so throughout the whole year, including the winter. Now, I'm a bit of a fair weather swimmer myself, but I've spoken to a good friend of mine who goes swimming right in the depths of winter to find out about it, and hearing her stories of her wild swimming has really inspired me with the story, which also weaves in some elements of a traditional story about the Selkie, the seal people. Maria woke up early in the morning, a week before her 50th birthday. It was the sound of the sea that woke her up. Although it wasn't an unusual thing for Maria to wake up early in the morning these days. And she found it so difficult to go back to sleep. Now, what she would normally do is maybe get up and perhaps she might do some work. She'd check her emails, maybe she'd go on social media, she'd make a cup of tea. Sometimes she might go back to bed and read a book and see if she could get back to sleep, but usually she stayed awake. And on this morning, a week before her 50th birthday, she wakes up and she hears the sound of the sea from out her window. And so she decides on this particular occasion that rather than making a cup of tea, rather than firing up her laptop, that she's going to walk down to the beach. And Maria lives in Cromer on the North Norfolk coast. And she's lived there for many years. She didn't grow up there. She grew up not far from the coast in another part of the country, as did her husband. And they both of them moved to Norfolk as students years ago, and that's how they met each other. And when they started a family, they both decided that they would move out to the coast because they could remember what it was like growing up near the coast when they were children. And this is the kind of childhood that they wanted to share with their own children. And so they'd lived in Cromer for many years now. And on this particular morning, as Maria is walking down to the beach, because she's got a milestone birthday coming up, she finds herself reminiscing about some of these times that they've shared together. She remembers all those summer days spent on the beach when the children were young, catching crabs from the sea, building sandcastles, picnics, ice cream, fish and chips. And the years passed, and then the kids were teenagers and they didn't really want to go to the beach with their parents anymore. But they would go down there and they'd have barbecues and they'd have beach parties with their friends. Sometimes Maria and her husband would go down there in the evening and they'd have a glass of wine on the beach together. And more recently, Maria had started going there with some of her friends. There was a group of them, a group of female friends. They'd all known each other for years. They'd met when their kids were young, and at school they met at the school gate. And some time ago, one of them had suggested that perhaps they might all give this wild swimming a go, because it does seem to be all the rage, particularly for women of a certain age. Well, initially, Maria had been a little bit reluctant. I mean, she loved swimming in the sea. She'd always loved it with the kids when they were younger, but you know, it was very much something that she enjoyed doing in the summer, and the idea of swimming in the sea in the winter was just, it just seemed to be unbearable. But this wasn't quite the winter yet. It was sort of like mid to late autumn, and so they all talked about it and they said, come on, let's all do it together. And so this is what they did. Once a week they would meet in the morning on the beach and they'd go wild swimming. Now Maria was, she did like to be prepared, and especially if she was going to be going into freezing cold water. She was one of these types of people that was always liked to plan and prepare. And she took the wild swimming very seriously. And, she would pack up all her layers of clothes. She'd fill up her hot water bottle so she could wrap her clothes around it. She had a foam mat so she could stand on there when she was getting herself dry afterwards. She had a hot flask of coffee to warm up afterwards. Well, the first time that they went wild swimming together, there was quite a lot of trepidation as they got changed into their swimming gear. Some of them had their wetsuits on, some of them had a swimming costume on. Maria had her wetsuit on, she wasn't going to take any chances. And they'd had a bit of a chat about how they were going to do it. They said, what should we do? Are we going to creep in, or are we just going to run in and just jump and just go for it? And they decided that's what they were all going to do. And so they all stood in a line along the shoreline. They held each other's hands, and then they ran at the water. And the cold, it was just like nothing they had ever experienced in their whole life. The absolute body shock of it. It literally took her breath away. Her heart was beating 10 to the dozen. It was painful. It was so cold, but it was amazing too, exhilarating, exciting, wild. And they screamed and they shouted and they splashed and they swore, and they stayed in there as long as they could absolutely bear it, which really wasn't for very long on that first occasion. And then they all came out, dried themselves off with their towels, got the warm clothes on that had been wrapped in those hot water bottles, sat and drank their coffee, and then they nipped into town and had some hot soup at a nearby cafe. And so this is what they've been doing every week, and she loved it. She loved the exhilaration, she loved the sisterhood, the fun of it all. It was wonderful. And she was thinking of all of this as she walked to the beach this week before her 50th birthday. And it was so early in the morning that it was still almost night, and the moon, it was almost full, was shining there in the sky. And as she got closer to the beach, and as she was just about to walk down the steps to go onto the beach, she saw something moving there on the beach. Figures moving, dancing in the moonlight, the light of the moon shining silver off of their skin. And she stood and watched, and for a moment she thought, is this the girls? Are they dancing? Have they come early today? Are they planning something for my birthday? But no, these were not her friends. These were not even people, although they looked like people. They looked human, they looked almost human, but not quite. She watched them dancing in the moonlight, and then she took a step further. And it was like they heard her, or they sensed her coming. And they ran at the sea. But just before they went into the sea, they each of them reached down onto the sand and they pulled something onto their bodies. Skin. Seal skin. And she watched as they transformed from these almost human-like creatures into seals, and they jumped into the sea and they were gone. And there was a memory of something, a story that her mother had told about the Selkie people that would come from the sea and climb out of their skins and dance in the moonlight. And all the way through the rest of that day, she couldn't stop thinking about it and wondering if perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her and she'd imagined it. And she thought about it that night as she went off to sleep, and then the next morning when she woke early again with the sound of the sea, and she went back down to the water wondering if she might see them again, and there they were. And now the moon was full, and she watched them there, dancing in the moonlight. And this time she took a couple of steps closer, but once again they sensed her coming. And they ran to the sea, slipping into their skins as they went, all except for one. A Selkie woman who turned and looked at her before pulling on her skin and jumping back into the water. And all through the day again she thought about this. And the next morning she woke again, a third morning she woke with the sound of the sea. She went down to the water and there they were again. And this time she stepped a little closer and they sensed her coming and they ran back into the sea, again slipping on their skins. But the Selkie woman, this time she lingered a bit longer and their eyes met. And Maria, she took a step closer and then the woman was gone, the Selkie woman, slipping into her skin, and she was swimming away. And when Maria went back the next day, they weren't there. Or the day after. Or the day after that. And as the days passed, those days leading up to her 50th birthday, she wondered if perhaps she had dreamt the whole thing. And then, in the morning of her 50th birthday, she woke early with the sound of the sea. Now there was much to be done that day. There was no way that she was going to manage to get back to sleep. And then she thought, this is a milestone birthday, this is a special day. And so she gathered, from the fireplace, she gathered up some kindling and she put it in a bag with her wetsuit and her towel and her hot water bottle and her extra layers and her hot coffee, and she went down to the sea. And she thought, it's my 50th birthday. Surely something magical is sure to happen. And as she came closer to the beach, and the beach was lit once again with a full moon, she expected to see them, the Selkie people, but they weren't there. No. Maybe I did imagine it, she thought. She went down onto the beach. She made herself a fire so that she could warm herself by the fire when she came out from the water. And she just sat by the fire for a moment, readying herself to go in. And then she saw something in the water, bobbing. It was the head of a seal. And as she sat there watching, the seal came closer and came out of the water and slipped out of its skin. And there she was, the Selkie woman, and their eyes met. And she reached out her hands, and Maria stood up, and she realised she still had all her clothes on, and so she slipped out of her own skin, of her human clothes. She slipped on her swimming skin of her wetsuit as she went into the water. But she didn't run in, screaming and squealing like she did with her friends. She took small steps, and with every step she could feel the water. She felt the cold inching up her body. But it felt good, because she felt so aware of her body. There was no shock of the sudden coldness. There was just this acceptance of this sensation in her body. And as she stepped further into the water, she felt herself gently yielding and surrendering to the holding of the water as it crept up her body until it reached her heart. And when it reached her heart, she knew that she was going for a swim. And she put her arms into the water and she started to swim. And the seal, never far from her side, And they swam in the water there together in the morning of her 50th birthday, diving and twisting and playing together, until Maria felt it was time to get out, to go and get warm by her fire. And as she dried herself and she drank her hot coffee and she got warm again, she looked out to the sea. And the seal and the Selkie woman, their eyes met once more before the seal bobbed down under the water and disappeared. And later on that day, there were all kinds of birthday treats in store for Maria. There were friends calling by with presents and cards. There was a special birthday lunch. There was a party in the evening. There was Prosecco and all of her favourite food. And it was wonderful, and it was special, and it was full of love. But none of it could quite match the magic of what she had experienced that morning with the Selkie woman. And if you happen to be passing by at a certain time of day, a certain time of the month, and perhaps the sea might be lit by the moon down there at the beach, it's possible that you might just see two heads bobbing in the water. But are they seals? Or are they women? Or maybe there's something in between.
In a beautiful forest, there lived a hermit. He had everything he needed. A little hut, a bed, a chair, table, and he had a cow. This was no ordinary cow. So the cow was a magical cow and could give him whatever he wanted. He could have fancy clothes if he wanted them. He could have a fast car if he wanted it. Not that a hermit ever would want a fast car, imagine it. He could even have a palace. But he didn't need a palace either. He was a hermit. He was content with sitting in his little hut with a bed, a table, a chair, and his thoughts. And every now and again, he would have a jug of milk. And that was enough for him and his life. Further away than anyone knew, there lived a king. He did not know about the hermit. This king was completely different from him. He had everything. He had a palace, he had huge armies, he owned so much land, he had so much. And then one of his advisors said to him one day, "Your Majesty, we have heard a story about a hermit who lives in a forest who has the cow of plenty to himself. You know, the cow that could give him anything." "A hermit?" says the king. "A hermit has the cow of plenty? Why?" "I want that cow. I will have that cow. Fetch my armies now. I want 300 men and the 10 best commanders." So they were sent for. And the king and those commanders, they got on those horses and they rode and they rode and they rode and they rode and they rode. They rode and they rode and they would have gone on riding if we needed to get to the end of the story. They rode and they rode and they rode and they rode. They went through a forest and another forest and another. They went on and on and on and on and on until eventually they reached the forest of the hermit. The hermit was in his little house, just listening to the birds singing. He could hear the cow munching just behind the hut, when suddenly, out the window, oh my, what on earth? He saw the shining glimmering of a gold crown, and then he saw the king. And then he saw his army. Oh, And he went outside, and he bowed, and he said, "Your Majesty, what an honor to see you in this beautiful forest on this beautiful day. What on earth are you doing here? What can I do for you?" And the king said, "I have come to see you." "Me? But I'm just a hermit. I have come to see you on very important business." "Well," said the hermit, "if it's important business, I will do whatever I can for you. I am just a simple man, but perhaps you would like to have some food first. And of course, I can see that you have a lot of commanders, and I can see you have a huge army. I better prepare some food for you all." And the king looked at the hermit and said, "I have come so many miles. I did not expect to meet a hermit who would boast. I mean, how on earth can you feed my army?" And the hermit turned around and called for his cow. "Sarabah! Come here! The king wishes to meet you." And with that, the great cow of plenty came from behind the hut of the hermit. The cow was huge. His udders were swinging backwards and forwards. His great head with his huge horns were rising up. They seemed to be as big as the trees. And there he was, munching away. "My friend Sarabah, do you think that you could produce some food for His Majesty?" And there the cow munched, and his udders began to swell. The king and the army watched in amazement as suddenly out of the udders came tables, chairs, 300 for the army, 10 for the commanders, and then out of another udder came a great throne for the king to sit on, and then a chair for the hermit. Simple, just like the man himself. "Now, I wonder what you would like to eat, Your Majesty." Of course, the king was looking around in amazement at all this furniture. I don't really mind." Pa, 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 pa. Steaming food came out of the udders and landed on all of the tables. And of course, the army was sat down, the commanders were sat down, the king was sat down, and so was the hermit. And everyone was eating the best food. Curries, naans, beautiful. Everything was wonderful. There were stews, there was breads, there were cheeses, and there they were eating, and there the king sitting opposite the hermit. He looked at him during the meal, and he said, "So, that's a clever cow you have there, huh?" "Yes, said the hermit. He is such a friend of mine." "Well," said the king, "how much do you want for him?" "Oh, well, he's not for sale. He's just the cow, my friend. He lives here with me. He's not for sale." "Oh, come, said the king. "He must be for sale. You must have a price. Name it. What do you want?" "I don't want for anything. I have everything. Forests, rivers, the company, my thoughts." Come. Look, here it is. I will give you 50 cows in exchange for your one cow." "But he's not for sale." "Why not?" said the king. "You have a cow aplenty, you're a hermit, you don't need the cow. I want to buy the cow." "He is not for sale. He is a magical cow. But to me, he is just my friend." "I see you drive a hard bargain. I'll give you 150 cows, 150, and 10 bulls as well." "I don't want them," said the hermit. "I don't need them. I have everything." "I see," said the king. "Well, as you can see by the crown on my head, that I am a king. I am wealthy, I have so much land, and I am very much used to getting what I want And with that, he clicked his fingers, and at that, the commanders beside him. Yes, they said, Your Majesty, what do you want? Fetch me that rope. And there, on the horses, was a rope. They were fetched. Now put that rope around the neck of the cow. And the hermit said, Well, what are you doing? You won't let me buy the cow, said the king, so I'm going to take her instead. By now, the rope was round her neck. And by now, 50 of the soldiers were on the end of the rope. Now pull! And they began to pull, and they pulled, and they pulled. But she put her hoofs down in the ground. You couldn't move her. The rest of the soldiers got on the end of the rope. Now there were 300 soldiers on the rope, and they pulled, and they pulled, and they pulled. She put her hoofs in the ground. She would not move. Commanders as well. Still she would not move. And he looked at the cow, and he looked at the king. He said, Leave her alone. And the cow, all this while with this great rope around his neck, with all these soldiers pulling him, refusing to go, the cow suddenly looked at the hermit and said, Do you want me to go, or do you want me to stay? He says, Of course, I want you to stay. You're my friend. But what can I do? I mean, look, he's a king. He's got all these commanders and all these soldiers. I can't stop him. I have no power. And he looked at the king. And the king looked at him and said, No, you can't stop me. He said, But I can do one thing, said the hermit. I can forgive you for what you are doing. I don't want your forgiveness, said the king. I just want the cow. And Sarabar, the great cow of plenty, looked at the hermit, his friend, and said, So, you want me to stay, do you? Yes, said the hermit. I just want you to stay. And when he said that, oh, how the cow began to grow. Oh, the horns already big, now came the size of trees themselves. His body grew bigger and bigger and bigger. His udders swelled and swelled and swelled. And of course the king looked up, the soldiers looked up, the commanders looked up, and suddenly out of those udders there came burning fires, flaming coals, bashing, crashing down on the ground. Flames came out of the mouth of Sarabar, and by now that was enough. The king was running towards his horse. So were the soldiers, and so were the commanders, and they were on their horses, and they were running and running and riding as fast as they could go. And as for the hermit, he watched the king going. He said, But all I want to do is forgive you. And he looked at Sarabar, and Sarabar was down on his knees. Get on my back. Get on my back, said Sarabar. So he climbed on his back, and now they were charging after the king. They rode and rode and rode and rode for hour after hour, and always they were closing more and more, getting closer and closer to the king. The king would look over his shoulder, Go away, go away. And the hermit was shouting, All I want to do is forgive you. Closer and closer, hour after hour, day after day, the chasing went on until the king realized. Stop, he said, stop. And his army stopped, and they turned around and looked at the king, and they could see the great cow coming, and there was the hermit sitting on his back. Stop, said the king. This is enough, enough. What do you want? And the hermit looked down at this king, and he said, All I want to do is forgive you. That is all I have, forgiveness. And with that, the king, he got off the back of his horse, and he walked over to the hermit up there. He said, How is it you have so much, and yet you have so little? It's just the way it is, said the hermit. And the king realized something. For all of his power, this hermit was stronger than him inside. I want to be like you, he said. I need to know what you have. All you have to do is say, you can hear those birds saying, All you have to do, said the hermit, is take the crown off your head, take the robes off your shoulders, leave your army behind, and do as I once did. Go into the forest, sit by a river, watch the fish come and go, listen to the birds singing. Live in this place, make yourself a fishing rod, learn how to make a fire, and that is all you need to do. And then you will be like me, if that's what you really want. And the king realized that was what he wanted, for he could see when he looked into the face of the hermit that there was something there. Some people call it wisdom, some inner calm. That's what it was. And so, with the crown gone away and the robes gone away, the army watched their king go into the forest. And as for the hermit, he turned Sarabah around and rode home. And by the time that he had got home, Sarabah was the size he had been before. And the hermit climbed off his back, stroked the head of his friend, and went into his little house. He sat down. He started thinking about the king. He drank some milk, and he looked out the window. And he could see Sarabah munching away. This is enough, he said. This is enough for me. This is all